Hi everybody, this is part 2 of the lecture to accompany Chapter 7 in your textbook. Please carefully read Chapter 7. There are ideas and examples that I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's learn how to standardize arguments. Diagramming works best with shorter arguments, but many of the arguments we hear or read in reality are much longer than just a few sentences. It would take too long and be too complicated to try to diagram those kinds of arguments. However, there is another way to analyze longer arguments called standardization. In it, you summarize the argument to make it clearer. You'll need a few skills to do this effectively: paraphrasing, and finding enthymemes, which are missing premises and conclusions. Let's look first at paraphrasing. I'm sure you've done this before, restated something in your own words to make sure you understand it and to make it clearer to someone else. Many people think that paraphrasing means to use less words to restate something, and that is sometimes the case, but just as often it means to use more words to clearly explain the idea. You want your paraphrase to be accurate, clear, concise, and charitable. Be accurate. This means to say what the statement really means. Don't misrepresent or change the meaning. In this quote by George Washington, Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have no or a very remote relation to ours. It would be an error to paraphrase that as Europe's vital interests are totally different than ours. He's not saying that. He's saying that their interests are different, but not totally. Obviously, there is what he refers to as a remote relationship. So the second paraphrase, Europe has a set of vital interests which are of little or no relationship to ours, is more accurate. Be clear. In the language chapter, I talked about the need to be precise to avoid ambiguity and vagueness. Clarity also involves not being too wordy. You need enough words to paraphrase, but don't go overboard either way. Here's a good example. High-quality learning environments are a necessary precondition for facilitation and enhancement of the ongoing learning process. What does that mean? It can be paraphrased very simply. Children need good schools to learn properly. Which leads to the next quality of a good paraphrase, conciseness. You leave out irrelevant and unimportant details and get to the essence of the argument's meaning. The office wasn't open at that point in time owing to the fact that there was no electrical power in the building. Yeah, that's a lot of blah, 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 when really the essence of that is the office was closed because the power was out. This is an example of conciseness that involves using less words to get to the essence of the meaning. Sometimes, however, you might need more words than the original statement to be concise. The book gives a good example of seeing a road sign that says, "Watch children." What does that mean? Well, a good paraphrase of it might be, watch for children playing near the road as they may dart out unexpectedly. And finally, be charitable in your paraphrases. We discussed the principle of charity before. We need to interpret the passage as charitably as the evidence reasonably permits. Try to stay away from absolutes unless the structure of the argument and the evidence provided leads to an absolute conclusion. Remember, if it would be a bad deductive argument but an okay inductive argument, assume it's inductive and make your paraphrases reflect that. Here's an example. Cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Therefore, if you continue to smoke, you are endangering your health. The first paraphrase of this, cigarette smoking guarantees that you will get lung cancer, continue to smoke and you will be unhealthy, uses some words that signify absolutes like guarantees and will be. The second paraphrase is better because it assumes that the arguer understands that these things are not absolute, that the risk is higher for someone's health to be affected by smoking, not that they will become ill, but that they certainly could become ill. So let's see if we can paraphrase these passages. The first one, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. Now that's an old proverb, you may have heard of it, but some people don't know what it means, so paraphrasing it will likely make the meaning clear. How about, people who complain are more likely to get attention than those who don't? That's a good one. Here's another one that's similar. If you don't speak up, your complaint will never be addressed. That's good too. There's no one right way to paraphrase. Both of those paraphrases meet the requirements for a good paraphrase. The next one, all men are created equal. Of course, you know that statement from the Declaration of Independence. Could you paraphrase it to make it clearer? It is a bit vague and possibly meant something a little bit different when it was first written than we think of it today. Maybe something like, all human beings have equal worth, equal rights, and equal potential. So we've clarified what that means. Those first two needed more words for their meanings to be clear. This last one could probably use less words and simpler language to be understood. With reference to yesterday's electronic mail communication from you, I would urge you to take into consideration that at this point in time there are no parking facilities within close proximity to the convention center due to the fact that the Jefferson Street parking garage is currently closed for repairs. How about, in reference to your email yesterday, you should know that there's no place to park near the convention center because the Jefferson Street parking garage is closed for repairs. I think that about sums it up. Let's move on to the next thing you need to know to standardize arguments, finding any missing premises or conclusions. Now, you might have noticed up to this point that most of the arguments we look at are kind of oddly stated, as in, all puppies are cute. Fufu is a puppy, so of course Fufu is cute. People generally don't talk like that. They might say, when you say, hey, is Fufu cute? Well, of course Fufu is cute. They'd leave out all the premises leading to that conclusion because it's kind of obvious how they came to that conclusion. Why state the obvious? So in real life, premises and conclusions are left out of arguments all the time for several reasons. As I said, one good reason is because they're just so obvious it would be silly to say them. Another reason, maybe not as good, is that people assume that everyone already understands and agrees with what's being left out, which may or may not be the case. And finally, the worst reason, and usually unethical reason, is because they don't want to address these unstated premises and hope that you will just accept their conclusion. These unstated premises and conclusions are called enthymemes. Here's an argument with an enthymeme, probably said to a teenager by a store clerk. You're under 21, so I can't sell you beer. There's an unstated premise here. I can't sell beer to anyone under 21. Why doesn't the store clerk say that? Well, it's obvious. When you're looking for enthymemes, what you need to do is identify if there are any missing premises. If there isn't enough to support the conclusion, how did they get from the premises that are stated to the conclusion? Well, determine what's needed to support the conclusion, and then that would be the enthymeme. Identify missing conclusions. If the statements are leading up to something but that thing is not stated, there's a missing conclusion. Be faithful to the arguer. Don't put in anything that contradicts what they already said or isn't true to their intentions. And of course, be charitable. Make sure the premise you add doesn't make the argument worse. You want to make it better. So there's no exact right way to do this. Everyone's different. The point is to make the argument clearer by making premises and conclusions clearer. Let's try this with a couple of examples. He's a U.S. citizen, so he's entitled to due process. The conclusion is he's entitled to due process, and he's a U.S. citizen is the premise. But is he's a U.S. citizen enough for us to assume that he's entitled to due process? No, there's something missing. All U.S. citizens are entitled to due process. Now the argument's complete, so it would be, he's a U.S. citizen. All U.S. citizens are entitled to due process, so he's entitled to due process. The second one, the bigger the burger, the better the burger. The burgers are bigger at Burger King. This is from an old advertising jingle for Burger King. It's pretty catchy, but there's something missing. I'll give you a hint. It's the conclusion. So let's say it again and add therefore at the end. Maybe you can figure out what it is. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. The burgers are bigger at Burger King, therefore the burgers are better at Burger King. I hope you can see how that comes naturally from what is said before. How about the third one? Angela is a blonde, so she's probably dumb. Well, the missing premise is most blondes are dumb. Now, as a blonde, I take exception to this premise. It's a stereotype. Nevertheless, that's the missing premise. Angela is a blonde. Most blondes are dumb, so she's probably dumb. No, she's not. Okay, the fourth one. Mary will do well on the test. She was paying close attention in class. The conclusion is the first statement. Mary will do well on the test. The premise is that she was paying close attention in class. What do you need to say to link those two things together? You need a premise that says something like people who pay close attention in class tend to do well on tests. This last one looks complete, but it's missing a premise. Boxing should be banned because it's dangerous. Dangerous sports should be banned is missing from that argument. So the argument would be dangerous sports should be banned. Boxing is a dangerous sport. Therefore, boxing should be banned. So I hope you can see why we have enthymemes and how we use them. So now that you understand paraphrasing, what enthymemes are and why it's important to discern them, let's use that knowledge to summarize arguments. It's called standardization because you're arranging the argument into standard logical form. And here are the steps. First, carefully read the argument with the purpose of identifying the main conclusion. Now, there might be more than one conclusion, certainly, but what you're looking for is the main thing the arguer is trying to prove. If it's missing, verbalize it. You need to know where the argument is heading. Then look for things that don't belong in the argument. Take out unnecessary or irrelevant material. Then go through and list the statements, not necessarily in the order that they occur, the way we numbered arguments that we were diagramming. It's the list of statements as they lead up to the conclusion. Fill in any enthymemes and put them where they belong. The main conclusion should be the last statement in the argument. And what are called parenthetical justifications for each sub-conclusion and the conclusion. What are those? Well, if statement 1 and 2 lead to sub-conclusion 3, then in parentheses put the numbers 1 and 2 next to sub-conclusion 3. Okay, you're probably confused right now. That's fine. I will show you and take you through an example of what I mean, because it might be easier to show you than to tell you. Here is an extended argument. Actually, in this extended argument, there are two shorter arguments with sub-conclusions that combine to come to a main conclusion. I would like you to stop the recording, carefully read this argument, and see if you can determine what the main conclusion is. And when you think you've got it figured out, start the recording again. Did you guess correctly? Remember, I said there are two arguments with sub-conclusions that lead to a main conclusion. If you read this over, you'll see that all the claims made here are really giving reasons why electric cars are just not ready for the American marketplace, or at least they weren't in 2015 when this argument was made. So when you write your standardization, this statement, electric cars are not yet ready to replace gasoline-powered vehicles in the American marketplace, that should be the last thing on the list because all the evidence is leading up to it. Okay, let's look at the two basic arguments inside this argument. The second and third sentence have to do with poor sales of electric cars. So that's probably an argument in and of itself. The remaining sentences in the paragraph are about how electric cars are still dependent on fossil fuels. And that's the other argument. So let's look at the first argument. In fact, sales of electric vehicles, or EVs, for most automakers have been poor. One key reason is that the range of EVs is relatively short and thus useful only for local driving. One key reason sounds like a premise, a reason why sales have been poor. Plus, there's an and in that sentence, so there are probably two reasons in that sentence. And there might be an enthymeme in there as well, so 3 premises and a conclusion. I'd like you to stop the recording again and see if you can figure it out. Let me just point out that your standardization of this argument probably won't be exactly the same as mine. What it should be is a clearer restatement of this argument. Okay, stop the recording, and when you're done, start it again. Now, like I said, yours may be somewhat different, but I hope you can see how I standardized this first part of the argument. I looked at the two sentences and realized the first sentence was the conclusion, because the second sentence had reasons that the first sentence was true. Those reasons were that, number one, the EV range is relatively short, and number two, that makes them only useful for local driving. But then I realized that there wasn't quite enough information to lead from those reasons to the conclusion that sales have been poor, so something was missing there. Okay, that's right, people don't generally want a car with such a short range. Yes, it's so obvious that it doesn't need to be part of the argument in real life, but in a standardization, we need to put it there. So that's my third premise. Since it's an enthymeme and unstated, we put it in parentheses. Then the sub-conclusion, consequently, sales of electric vehicles for most automakers have been poor. That's number 4 on that list. And I put the numbers of the premises I used to get to the conclusion in parentheses after it. So where it says from 1 to 3. Okay, let's go back and look at the second part of the argument. Here's what it is. Also, people who support EVs as a means of reducing fossil fuel dependence should remember that in many cases, fossil fuels generate the electricity that charges EVs. If the country truly wants to shift from fossil fuels, policymakers should consider other sources of energy such as nuclear and biodiesel. Indeed, if EVs are to be a viable technology and replace fossil fuels, people must address broader energy concerns. Can you tell that this argument is a bit redundant and wordy? I think we can simplify it to make it clearer. I think that the last 2 sentences in this argument are basically repetitive. They're both saying that we should consider other sources of energy. So that sounds like a sub-conclusion to me. Anything with the word should in it is probably a conclusion. See if you can figure out how to get to that sub-conclusion from the information you're given. So again, just like before, try and lead up to that conclusion. Okay, here's what I came up with. Yours may vary, but as long as you get the gist of the argument and you are clear, you should be fine. As I said, I figured this part was unnecessarily wordy. The first part of the first sentence is really a suggestion that people who support EVs should remember. It's a suggestion and not a statement. But the second part, that fossil fuels generate the electricity that charges EVs, is an important premise. But again, by itself, it doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that policymakers should consider other sources of energy. There's something that's missing from there, and it's something very obvious. Fossil fuels are becoming a scarce resource. So if I put that in there, then I have 2 good reasons that lead to that conclusion. Fossil fuels still generate much of the electricity that charges electric vehicles. Fossil fuels are becoming a scarce resource, so policymakers should consider other sources of energy such as nuclear and biodiesel to fuel these cars. From 5 and 6. So here is my entire standardization of this argument. 1 through 3 lead to the sub-conclusion 4 that sales have been poor. 5 and 6 lead to 7 that policymakers should consider other sources of energy. But can I go directly from those sub-conclusions to the conclusion? No, because there's still something else that's there but unstated. Maybe it's that this technology to make the range longer and to use other sources of energy simply isn't ready yet for use in mass market vehicles. That's what's missing. It's implied but not stated. So once I put it in there, the conclusion that electric cars aren't ready for the marketplace makes sense. Now, I don't know how different yours is from mine. What I do know is that the more you look at arguments in order to analyze them, the easier it gets. You'll be doing diagramming and standardization in your assignments, and we will also be doing them in class. This is the end of the lecture to accompany Chapter 7.